Trump sues over Steele dossier, alleging reputational damage and distress. London, Donald Trump's legal battles crossed the Atlantic on Monday with the start of a hearing against a former MI6 officer's intelligence consultancy, which Trump says caused him personal and reputational damage and distress. The 45th president is bringing a claim against Christopher Steele, a former British spy, and his consultancy, Orbis Business Intelligence, for alleged data protection breaches after the leak of an explosive dossier containing allegations that Russia had compromising material on Trump. Steele was the author of what's known as the Steele dossier, which made extravagant allegations about contacts between Trump's 2016 election campaign and Russian officials, and said that Trump engaged in perverted sexual acts that were monitored by Russian security services. Many of the allegations were never proved. Trump previously dismissed the dossier as fake news and called Steele a failed spy. Hugh Tomlinson, a lawyer for Trump, told a London court on Monday that Trump would deny the scandalous claims by giving evidence in this court. Tomlinson is a high-profile lawyer whose clients have included King Charles III and David and Victoria Beckham. In his witness statement, seen by the Washington Post, Trump said that the allegations in the dossier were wholly untrue. "I can confirm that I did not, at any time, engage in perverted sexual behavior, including the hiring of prostitutes, in the presidential suite of a hotel in Moscow," he wrote. He also said he did not take part in sex parties in St. Petersburg, nor did he pay bribes to Russian officials in order to further my business interests or arrange for or connive in the silencing of any witnesses by coercion or bribery. "None of these things ever happened," he wrote, adding that he wanted to prove, by evidence at trial, that the data are false. In filings to London's High Court, Trump's lawyers said he was seeking unspecified compensation for the infliction of personal and reputational damage and distress. Trump was compelled to explain to his family, friends, and colleagues that the embarrassing allegations about his private life were untrue, they wrote. This was extremely distressing for the claimant. Lawyers for Orbis, a London-based firm founded by former British intelligence professionals, are seeking to have the case thrown out on the grounds that it doesn't have a real prospect of succeeding and has been brought too late. In written arguments, Orbis lawyer Anthony White said that Trump had made numerous abusive personal attacks and slurs against Steele and that the former president had an extensive track record of using legal proceedings to harass, bully, and intimidate his perceived opponents. Steele is a former British spy who at one point was in charge of the service's Russia desk. He wrote the report for Fusion GPS, a private investigation firm that received funding from Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee. The dossier was leaked to BuzzFeed, which published it in early 2017. After Steele was revealed as the person who assembled the report, he briefly went into hiding. This is not the first time that Steele and Orbis have been sued over the dossier in British courts. In 2020, Britain's High Court dismissed a libel claim by Russian businessman Alexei Gubarev. A judge ruled that, while references in the report were defamatory and caused harm to Gubarev's reputation, Steele could not be held responsible for the report becoming public. In a separate case, Orbis was ordered to pay Russian oligarchs Petr Avin and Mikhail Friedman $22,000 each after they brought a case claiming the dossier contained inaccurate personal data relating to them that was non-compliant under data protection laws. Trump is fighting several cases in U.S. federal and state courts. The hearing in London is scheduled for 2 days. A decision is expected at a later date. U.S. to ease sanctions on Venezuelan oil for freer presidential election. Bogotá, Colombia, the Biden administration and the Venezuelan government of President Nicolas Maduro have agreed to a deal in which the United States would ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry and the authoritarian state would allow a competitive, internationally monitored presidential election next year, according to 2 people familiar with the breakthrough talks. The sanctions relief is to be announced after Maduro's government and Venezuela's U.S.-backed opposition sign an agreement to include commitments by the socialist government to allow a freer vote in 2024, the people said. They're expected to do that during a meeting in Barbados on Tuesday with U.S. officials in attendance. Maduro, who claimed victory in a 2018 election widely viewed as fraudulent, would agree to a process for lifting bans on opposition candidates running, one of the people said, though it is not clear how quickly that process would take place. They spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the talks. The deal, which follows multiple attempts at negotiation between the Maduro government and opposition, would be the most significant progress in Venezuela's political stalemate in years. It also suggests a willingness on behalf of the Biden administration to provide incentives to Maduro in the hopes of ensuring free and fair presidential elections in 2024. The talks are part of a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy in Venezuela, after a years-long effort to put maximum pressure on the Maduro government failed to bring solutions to the country's crisis. A senior administration official said the deal did not include plans to unfreeze Venezuelan assets currently held in the United States. The official declined to comment on the administration's talks with Maduro's government. The United States is likely to put a time limit on any sanctions relief so that it could be reversed if Maduro didn't comply with his end of deal. After this report was published, a U.S. official said the United States and Venezuela had not committed to anything between them. The administration has been clear, we support a Venezuelan-led negotiation and are prepared to provide sanctions relief in response to concrete actions toward competitive elections, said the official, who spoke on the condition of anonymity under rules imposed by the administration. The key conversations are between the opposition and Maduro, the official said. Under the deal, the two people said, Maduro would commit to accepting international electoral observations and opening up media access for the elections. It was not clear if the deal would also involve the release of political prisoners in Venezuela. The Norwegian embassy in Mexico confirmed the Barbados meeting in a tweet Monday morning. The Norwegian government, which is facilitating the talks, said the Venezuelan government and the Unitary Platform, a coalition of Venezuelan opposition leaders, will be returning to negotiations with the goal of reaching a political agreement. The delegations were expected to arrive in Barbados on Monday. If the deal is signed, the U.S. government is prepared to announce the lifting of certain oil sanctions against Venezuela, the two people said. The sanctions relief could include a general license for Venezuela's state-owned oil agency to resume business with the United States and other countries. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller said the United States welcomes the announcement by Maduro representatives and the Unitary Platform to resume Venezuelan-led negotiations in Barbados. Along with like-minded partners and other friends of Venezuela, the United States will continue its efforts to unite the international community in support of the Venezuelan-led negotiation process, Miller said in a statement. U.S. officials have said they would consider easing sanctions if Maduro laid the groundwork for free and fair presidential elections. The agreement comes days before Venezuela's opposition parties plan to hold a primary vote to choose a single candidate to back against Maduro. The frontrunner in the unofficial primary, Maria Corina Machado, is one of several opposition leaders the Maduro government has barred from running for office. The disqualification was sharply condemned by the U.S. government. The United States has imposed sanctions against the Venezuelan government or individuals for more than 15 years, but significantly tightened them in early 2019 after declaring Maduro's 2018 victory illegitimate. The Trump administration sanctioned Venezuela's state oil company, the central bank, and key government officials. Then it imposed a wider economic embargo. It froze the property and interests of the Maduro government in the United States and prohibited Americans from doing business with the government. The deal emerged from direct talks between Biden administration officials and Maduro government representatives that began last year during the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The administration sought to drive a wedge between Venezuela and its close ally, Russia, while also addressing soaring gas prices sent higher by the war in Ukraine. That changed the calculus, not just in terms of energy, which is an important element, but the fact that it's 2023, not 1993, said Caleb McCary, the Bush administration's Cuba transition coordinator and a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. McCary helped negotiate the release of an American citizen from Venezuelan custody in 2018. We're living in a different world, McCary said, and this is exactly the kind of diplomacy that is needed to advance American interests abroad. Last year, the Biden administration began easing restrictions on Chevron, the main U.S. oil company with assets in Venezuela, in a gesture intended to support talks between the Maduro government and the opposition. The United States also announced this month it would resume direct deportation flights to Venezuela, another sign of thawing relations between the two countries. The strained relationship had limited the United States' ability to return undocumented Venezuelan migrants. U.S. sanctions cost Venezuela billions of dollars in oil revenue each year. In 2016, the last year before financial sanctions, oil accounted for 95% of all exports. U.S. officials and other observers have noted that Maduro had already run his oil industry and economy into the ground before the sanctions took effect. But studies show the sanctions have exacerbated poverty in the country. More than 7 million Venezuelans, a quarter of the population, have fled, and the country continues to hemorrhage migrants, many heading to the United States. The deal to be signed Tuesday would be only a partial agreement. Many details will need to be resolved in the coming weeks and months, analysts say, to ensure that next year's elections are in fact free and fair. This is not going to be a magical overnight solution, said Jeff Ramsey, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who watches Venezuela. There's going to be a continued need for Washington to support the opposition negotiators moving forward. Now the hard part begins. But he added, this is the one thing that could change the game moving forward. McCary said the sanctions relief, if successful, would set an important precedent for U.S. foreign policy in other countries. We spend an awful lot of time responding to crises with sanctions, he said. This demonstrates that you can leverage sanctions relief to achieve political, diplomatic, and economic ends. In the current global context, that's a very important signal for the United States to send. Herrero reported from Caracas, Venezuela, and DeYoung reported from Washington. How the Israel-Gaza conflict is unfolding in maps, graphics, and videos. It has been more than a week since Hamas militants crossed into Israel on a murderous rampage, killing more than 1,300 people and taking hostages, the start of a bloody and unpredictable new chapter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli military has responded by pummeling the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip with airstrikes, killing more than 2,600 Palestinians, and massing troops along the border in preparation for a ground offensive. Israel called upon 1.1 million Palestinians who live in northern Gaza to leave the area, a directive that the United Nations said was not feasible and could transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation. The conflict has brought fear, destruction, and uncertainty for millions in the region. Here's how the events have been unfolding. NLT, BNGT, Day 10 NLT/BNGT, Monday, October 16. Evacuations in southern Lebanon. The Israeli Defense Ministry on Monday released a list of 28 communities along the northern border of Lebanon to begin evacuating to state-funded accommodations. The communities are mostly within 1.2 miles of the Lebanese border. Israel has long been enemies with Lebanon-based militant group Hezbollah, and the two sides have intermittently shelled each other. Skirmishes between the two have been routine for decades, but tensions have been high since the Israel-Gaza war that began October 7. The Israel Defense Forces said earlier Monday that it had struck Hezbollah military infrastructure in Lebanon overnight in retaliation for an attack on Israeli territory Sunday. NLT, BNGT, Day 9 NLT/BNGT, Sunday, October 15. Troops spotted near the border. As a ground invasion looms, Israeli troops and armored vehicles were seen in multiple locations near the northern and eastern borders with Gaza on Saturday and Sunday. Several vehicles amassed in the southern Israeli city of Ashkelon. Tanks were also spotted in Nahal Oz, an Israeli town near Gaza City. NLT, BNGT, Day 8 NLT/BNGT, Saturday, October 14. Gaza residents flee south. The main roads running north to south were crowded for a second day Saturday after the Israeli military called for civilians to move south of the Wadi Gaza wetlands through designated streets. Many fled on foot. But some civilians refused to leave northern Gaza, fearing that escape routes are too dangerous. Hamas's media office said airstrikes hit cars as they headed south from Gaza City, killing 70 people. NLT, BNGT, Day 7 NLT/BNGT, Friday, October 13. Israel calls for evacuations. Israel told the 1.1 million people living in northern Gaza to move south within 24 hours, a warning the United Nations called impossible without devastating humanitarian consequences. Included in the directive was Gaza City, the Strip's most densely populated area. The call came as Israel continued to pummel the Strip with bombs and the death toll surged past 1,500. The United Nations said an estimated 600,000 people are displaced to the southern half of Gaza, though this number is likely an undercount. With exits to Israel and Egypt closed, Gazans have nowhere to go. A mass evacuation could transform what is already a tragedy into a calamitous situation, the United Nations said. NLT, BNGT, Day 6 NLT/BNGT, Thursday, October 12. Preparing for a ground assault. Israeli tanks deployed to the border with Gaza, and reservists arrived for duty at the Julis military base near Ashkelon. Meanwhile, the Israeli bombardment of Gaza continued. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, a spokesman for the IDF, said in a televised briefing that Israel would no longer allow Hamas to exist next door. Unlike other operations, we are collapsing the governance and sovereignty of the Hamas organization, he said. Deep underground, in the northern Israeli city of Haifa, medics lined up hospital beds and braced for the possibility of a wider regional escalation. After rocket fire from Syria earlier in the week, Israel launched missile strikes on two of the nation's main airports, authorities in Damascus said. NLT, BNGT, Day 5 NLT/BNGT, Wednesday, October 11. Gaza loses power. Israeli strikes on Gaza intensified, many concentrated in heavily populated areas in the north. The death toll surpassed 1,100 people, and more than 263,000 people were displaced across the Strip. The United Nations announced 11 workers were killed. Palestinian authorities said Gaza's only power plant had run out of fuel and was no longer operating. Israel provides Gaza with power in two ways. Gaza's power plant runs on imported diesel fuel. There are also 10 direct power lines from Israel to Gaza. Now, both sources were cut off. NLT, BNGT, Day 4 NLT/BNGT, Tuesday, October 10. Scenes of more destruction. Bodies in Israel were still being found. After 2.5 days of intense fighting in Kfar Aza, one of the first towns attacked, soldiers escorted journalists through scenes of utter ruin. Homes were burned, cars were smashed, and the air smelled of death. Israeli commanders said they had gained control of the border around Gaza, but Hamas continued to fire rockets into Israel, even as IDF airstrikes targeted militant infrastructure and command posts. The military said it had carried out more than 2,000 strikes across Gaza since Saturday, killing hundreds of Palestinians. Israel pledged to focus its fire on Hamas fighters and abide by international law. 2 members of Hamas's political office were killed. But mosques, hospitals, residential buildings, and international aid groups were also hit. NLT, BNGT, Day 3 NLT/BNGT, Monday, October 9. A complete siege of Gaza. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered a complete siege of Gaza, saying Israel would cut off supplies of power, food, and gas. Gazans have lived for 16 years under an Israeli blockade supported by Egypt and are heavily dependent on Israel for electricity and other basic services. Cutting off gas and power could leave many residents not only without electricity, but also without clean drinking water, proper sanitation, and health care. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk would a day later condemn the siege, saying that depriving civilians of goods essential for their survival is prohibited under international humanitarian law. As airstrikes on Gaza continued, fleeing Palestinians saw their last hope erased. Strikes near the Rafah crossing with Egypt, the last route out of the territory, closed the checkpoint indefinitely, leaving civilians with nowhere to go. NLT, BNGT, Day 2 NLT/BNGT, Sunday, October 8. Fighting continues, death toll rises. Fighting continued with militant holdouts inside Israel as the country formally declared war on Hamas. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group that is allied with Hamas, fired dozens of rockets into northern Israel. The Israel Defense Forces launched a punishing campaign of airstrikes on Gaza, displacing thousands of people in the first 24 hours. In Israel, the death toll continued to rise. More than 250 bodies were recovered at the site of a trance music festival held just 3 miles away from the Gaza border. Survivors described tired festivalgoers running for their lives in a wide-open field as militants gunned them down. NLT, BNGT, Day 1 NLT/BNGT, Saturday, October 7th. Day of the attack. Early Saturday morning, under the cover of thousands of rockets, Hamas militants breached Israel's high-tech smart wall and went on a killing rampage in small towns across southern Israel. The ambush took Israeli forces by surprise. Officials said the attackers overran more than 20 communities. It took the military 10 hours to arrive in some towns. By that point, hundreds of civilians were already dead. Militants are believed to have taken more than 100 hostages into Gaza. As Putin visits China, new anti-Western coalition turns on Israel. Riga, Latvia, as Russian President Vladimir Putin flies to Beijing to meet his strongest, most crucial ally, Chinese President Xi Jinping, the leaders are each hobbled by crises of their own making, Russia's disastrous war on Ukraine, and China's economic stumbles, which have frayed confidence in Xi's management. But their meeting, at China's Third Belt and Road Summit, is also an opportunity to showcase their alliance and partnership against the United States and other Western nations at a moment of global tumult. While Western leaders have firmly backed Israel, Russia and China have carefully avoided describing the October 7 Hamas attack that killed more than 1,400 Israelis as terrorism. Instead, they called for an end to the violence and the revival of efforts to forge a two-state solution, a decades-old concept that Israelis and Palestinians have never managed to implement. Moscow and Beijing each habitually accuse Washington of a Cold War mentality and of trying to split the world into geopolitical blocs. Putin's deepening relationship with Xi is evidence of hardening of global fault lines, as China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran line up on one side, and the United States and its NATO and Pacific allies on the other. Meanwhile, numerous global South nations are reluctant to take a side. For Putin, increasingly isolated and tarnished by the war on Ukraine, the trip to Beijing is a key moment to project the image of a leader with powerful friends, although he is increasingly perceived as a junior partner reliant on Xi's favor. This relationship is actually deeper and more robust now, 2 years after the war, than it was before the war. And it is happening much more on Chinese terms, said Alexander Gabov, a China and Russia expert at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. Gabov said Russia and China are growing closer amid Putin's war-related problems and Xi's economic difficulties, as both confront the United States. China is having some significant headwinds, both due to some domestic circumstances and also its competition with the United States. But this set of issues has also provided certain boost to the bilateral relationship, he said. Russia has nowhere else to go for a large new market for its commodities. Putin, quite literally, has very few other places he can go. The Russian president's travel has been curbed by an international criminal court arrest warrant over alleged war crimes, and the trip this week is just his second visit abroad since his March indictment, following a trip last week to the Kyrgyz capital of Bishkek. Putin's major diplomatic showpieces this year, including a visit by Xi in March and a Russia-Africa summit in July, were both on Russian soil. The two will hold one-on-one meetings on Wednesday, according to Russian presidential aide Yuri Ashikov. Putin is also due to address the Belt and Road Summit, which is marking 10 years of Xi's massive global infrastructure project. A no-limits friendship agreement that the two leaders signed early last year, when Putin attended the Olympics in Beijing just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has quietly grown stronger. Putin is increasingly dependent on Beijing's support to weather a war that led to unprecedented economic sanctions against Russia and exposed the Kremlin's military weakness. Wary of Western sanctions, China has been careful to avoid tacitly supporting Russia's war against Ukraine, touting itself as a potential peacemaker and releasing a set of principles that called for peace in Ukraine. But the Chinese plan left the major issues unaddressed and predictably has gained no traction. Meanwhile, Putin and other senior officials have put Russia forward as a potential peace mediator in the Middle East, a role that seems a bit far-fetched, both because of Russia's continued bombing of Ukrainian civilians and because of the recent failure of Russian peacekeepers to uphold a ceasefire between Azerbaijan and Armenia in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Still, Russia and China see themselves as civilizational states, with China boasting of 5,000 years of civilization, and Russia trumpeting of millennium-old civilization, even as it denies Ukraine's history and condemns Western nations' colonial pasts. both China and Russia employ rhetoric to appeal to leaders in the global south who often seem content to play big powers against each other. On the most practical level, the Russia-China trade relationship has become increasingly important. Recent trade figures show a decline in Chinese exports to the United States, Europe and members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, while Russia has emerged as an important export market, showing a 56% increase in the first 9 months of the year. But China's exports to Russia of critical semiconductors exploded after the invasion of Ukraine, according to an analysis in May by Free Russia Foundation. The products are crucial in the manufacturing of many weapons systems. Beijing's trade relations with Moscow are the brightest spot in its trade statistics, amid tumbling exports to other important markets. Western sanctions, meanwhile, destroyed Russia's main oil and gas market, forcing a massive pivot to China, India and others, a switch that boosted Russia-China trade by 32% last year. In an interview with China Media Group published on the Kremlin website Monday, Putin predicted that Russian trade with China would reach $200 billion by the end of the year. In the field of energy, which occupies a special place in our relations, Russia now ranks first among Chinese partners in the supply of energy resources to China in value terms. First place, Putin boasted. He also extolled the growth of Chinese car sales in Russia, the main replacement for cars made by Western firms that pulled out of Russia after the invasion. China's share in Russian vehicle imports for the first 8 months of 2023 rose to 92%. Compared with 10% in 2021, according to Ruslan Davidov, acting head of the Federal Customs Service of Russia. Sales are expected to increase to at least 380,000 vehicles by the end of the year, according to China's Xinhua news agency. In addition to China, Putin has been forced to turn to Iran and North Korea for drones, artillery shells, rockets and other weapons. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said Friday that North Korea had provided 1,000 containers of ammunition and military equipment to Russia for its war on Ukraine, releasing images that he said depicted hundreds of North Korean containers headed for Russia. In August, Russia and China teamed up in the UN Security Council to block a unified response to North Korea's spate of ballistic missile tests, as Washington warned of a growing nuclear threat from Pyongyang. Pro-Kremlin media has trumpeted the Beijing visit as a sign of Putin's global clout, reporting that he will be the Belt and Road Summit's guest of honor. The pro-Kremlin Pravda news site predicted that Putin's strong anti-Western position would have a decisive effect on Xi's willingness to confront the United States. But while Russia and China often highlight their close cooperation in appending Washington's global dominance and forging a multipolar world, each is focused primarily on national interests as they seek to expand their own clout. In practical terms, the both pointed to a 40% increase in bilateral trade this year, after last year's 32% rise. How Hamas's carefully planned Israel attack devolved into a chaotic rampage. This story contains graphic images. Tel Aviv, on the morning of October 7, hundreds of Hamas militants switched on their GoPros and cell phones and began live-streaming the deadliest attack in Israel's history, massacring at least 1,400 people and abducting nearly 200, according to Israeli authorities. What began as a highly organized stealth attack, using drone technology to overtake Israeli military observation points, soon devolved into a bloody and chaotic rampage. It underscored Hamas's capacity for sophisticated planning and indiscriminate killing, the ability of the group to conceal details of a massive offensive operation and its struggle to manage fighters once they had bulldozed their way through Israel's border fence. It was, by both Palestinian and Israeli accounts, a staggering and unexpected Hamas victory and an indictment of Israel's vaunted military and intelligence services. Hamas's political leadership in exile said it was shocked at the lack of resistance. We were expecting to get a smaller number of hostages and return, but the army collapsed in front of us. What were we to do? Ali Baraki, a Beirut-based Hamas representative, said in an interview with the Washington Post on Monday. The Israeli army has become a paper tiger, Baraki continued, and that's why the number of hostages was so big, and the number of Israeli casualties was so big. Miri Eisen, a former senior intelligence officer in the Israel Defense Forces, said the operation was the result of at least 2 years of planning, a period that included 2 conflicts between the IDF and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a smaller militant group in Gaza. At the time, Hamas was criticized for standing on the sidelines as PIJ leaders were eliminated by Israeli strikes. It was part of a vast con, said Eisen, to lull Israel into complacency, while Hamas gathered intelligence and quietly built up its capabilities. The fighters' apparent knowledge of Israeli border towns could have been gleaned in part from the thousands of Gazans who crossed the Israeli border on a daily basis, Eisen said, earning wages in the same communities that were overrun. Those who attacked Israel are not terrorist squads, but a commando brigade belonging to a large army, numbering in the tens of thousands, built over time with funds intended for humanitarian causes, said Meir Ben Shabbat, a former Israeli national security advisor, adding that some of the militants carried data files on the territories and settlements they raided. In a rare all-staff memo made public on Monday, Ronan Bar, the director of Israel's Shin Bet intelligence agency, took responsibility for the failure to foresee the attack. "The responsibility is mine," Bar wrote. "Despite a series of actions we carried out, unfortunately, we were unable to establish sufficient deterrence so as to thwart the attack." By posting footage of the assault on its Telegram page, Hamas magnified the psychological warfare against Israelis and glorified the killing rampage for its online audience of supporters. "Time for photographs," said one militant, pointing his phone at a body, blood running down the sidewalk. Another man in a flak jacket shot a rifle into the air. The gunmen held hundreds of families hostage in their homes, forcing some to feed them, or to watch as they killed relatives, witnesses have said. The militants burned corpses, beheaded a wounded man with a garden hoe and fatally shot drivers as they entered residential towns, according to hours of videos gathered by the Israeli military, some of which were shared with journalists on Monday. The images could not be independently verified by the Post. The Israeli military is holding a number of gunmen from Gaza that it captured in the course of the attacks, officials said, and the captives have provided material and information that remains classified. The militants had equipped themselves for a prolonged incursion, the IDF said Monday. They came with a lot of food, ammunition, medical aid, said IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari. They were not just planning to be there for a couple of hours. But the footage that has flooded social media also shows Hamas struggling in real time to deal with its horrifying success. As the killing expanded to more than 20 Israeli towns and kibbutzim, one video shows militants trying to cram a large group of wounded hostages, 2 bodies deep, into the back of pickup truck. Militants who streamed in on motorcycles scrambled to find vehicles to carry their hostages back to Gaza. In Kfar Aza, militants went down the lines of parked cars, breaking windows and looking for one to steal. Yafa Adar, an 85-year-old grandmother from the community of Nir Oz, was ferried over the border on a golf cart. In 2011, Israel traded more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for a single Israeli soldier. Palestinian militants now hold 199 hostages, Israeli officials confirmed Monday. This was a unique mixture of state-of-the-art, disciplined planning, combined with barbarism and brutality, said Shimrit Meir, a former senior advisor in the previous Israeli government. Baraki, the Hamas representative, said the aim of attack was to free Palestinian prisoners, stop Israeli aggression on Al-Aqsa Mosque, and to break the siege on Gaza. Instead, the assault has led to unprecedented Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, killing more than 2,700 people, and has rallied much of the world behind Israel as it prepares for a large-scale land invasion. "We have prepared ourselves for the ground assault, we're not afraid of it," Baraki said. Hamas thinks they carried out this operation, this thing that they called an attack for their freedom, and through their framing, they believe that they will win the coming war against Israel, said Eisen, the former IDF intelligence officer. But just as Hamas removed all red lines in targeting civilians, so too will Israel retaliate, she said, predicting a war for which we don't yet have the words to describe. The Hamas attack was, above all, an opportunistic one, experts said, a response to Israeli and Palestinian political dysfunction. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government had spent months pushing through a plan to weaken his country's judicial system, setting off nationwide protests, including among military reservists. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, Hamas's longtime rival, was teetering on collapse, seen by many as complicit in Israeli raids that have made 2023 the deadliest year for Palestinians in the occupied territory in 2 decades. The authority, and its aging leader Mahmoud Abbas, stood to gain from a U.S. diplomatic push to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, efforts that may have been permanently derailed by the attack. Hamas sought to make themselves relevant, and to this end, its tactics were atrocities, said Anat Kurz, a senior fellow at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies. As fighters temporarily seized hundreds of kilometers of Israeli territory, many Palestinians rejoiced. "We finally realized that Israel can be broken," said Ghassan Khatib, a former Palestinian politician in the West Bank. He believes Hamas would sweep Palestinian national elections if they were held tomorrow. Dadach reported from Beirut and Hendricks from Jerusalem. Poland election results favor the opposition in a political earthquake. Europe on Monday stood on the brink of a political earthquake, as election results in Poland suggested the end of power for a hard-right government that chipped away at liberal democracy, stifled the free press and exerted control over the courts while undermining LGBTQ+ and women's rights. Now one of the world's strongest pillars of conservative illiberalism, Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party, faces the same stark choice that confronted Donald Trump in the United States and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil: how to handle defeat in the same democracy it sought to undermine. Observers see little chance of the kind of insurrections that jarred Washington and Brasilia. But law and justice, many argue, including some in the party itself, may not go that gently. Under Poland's parliamentary system, a transition of power could be dragged out for 2 to 3 months, during which time Law and Justice, known by its acronym PiS, is likely to search for potential defectors in opposition ranks. "I'm optimistic that we will not experience any kind of attempt to put the election results in question in such a significant way what happened in the US or Brazil," said Piotr Boris, head of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. "But I have no illusion that PiS will try various ways to stay in power, or at least to make the formation of the new government more difficult." With more than 99.76% of ballots counted, Law and Justice remained the top vote-getter, with 35.5%. But it appeared to fall well short of a governing majority, and without a path to a governing coalition. The opposition Civic Platform, although running in second place with 30.6% of the vote, appeared to be in the far stronger position. It has two likely coalition partners, the Third Way and the Left Party, which would help it achieve a comfortable majority. Turnout was over 74%, the highest in Poland since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Donald Tusk, a former Polish prime minister and former president of the European Council, preemptively declared victory for the opposition after the release of an exit poll on Sunday: "Poland has won, democracy has won. We have removed them from power." As the official count emerged on Monday, Polish citizens, European leaders and analysts became increasingly comfortable venturing that a sea change was underway. We still have to wait for the final results. But the advance taken by the Polish opposition, which was able to unite the center-right, the center and the left against the conservative populism in power, is a tremendous sign of hope for Poland and its place in Europe. Nathalie Loiseau, a French lawmaker in the European Parliament, wrote on X, formerly known as Twitter. "What it means for Europe is a major shift," said Rosa Balfour, director of Carnegie Europe, a Brussels think tank. "If we get a government without law and justice, the relationship between Warsaw and Brussels, which has deteriorated steadily, would change." But whether Tusk would get the nod to form a centrist, pro-Europe government remained uncertain. And even if he does become prime minister once more, aspects of 8 years of hard-right rule may be difficult to undo. Some policy changes, such as loosening penalties for abortions, could be done through ministry edicts. But others would need the endorsement of courts where law and justice allies remain entrenched. Other changes would require the cooperation of Polish President Andrzej Duda, who is firmly in the hard-right camp and maintains veto rights through the end of his term in May 2025. Under Poland's parliamentary system, it is up to Duda to pick a prime minister to try to form a government. He gave no inkling of how he would proceed in public comments on Monday, though previously he indicated that he would select someone from the winning party. Joachim Brudziński, Law and Justice's campaign manager, told Polish media he expected incumbent Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki to get the call again. "However you look at it, we won," Brudziński told Polish radio. "It seems to me in an obvious way that President Andrzej Duda will entrust this mission to law and justice. Law and Justice lawmaker Radoslaw Fogiel told Poland's Radio Z that his party would woo every member of parliament who was pro-state and does not want to submit to Tusk's diktats. Asked whether PiS would be ready to horse-trade the Prime Minister's office to the centre-right Third Way alliance as a way to remain in power, Fogiel replied, "It's too early to speculate today, but we are open to a wide variety of talks." Analysts said untangling the results could drag through Christmas. Ultimately, though, they predict Law and Justice will have to accept a place in the opposition. The far right has made some dramatic gains in Europe, especially since the pandemic. But a loss of power in Poland, one of its core strongholds, would be a huge blow. It would suggest that the far right is susceptible to the same economic pressures that have pushed out incumbents from traditional political parties. It would also highlight the ability of moderates to rally in make-or-break moments. The opposition portrayed this election as the last, best chance to forestall Poland's descent into autocracy. Exit polls suggested opposition support relied heavily on younger voters, highly educated urban dwellers and Poles living in the industrialized western half of the country, which has deeper historical ties to the rest of Europe. If Tusk ultimately earns the chance to lead the government, there would be high expectations that he would repair relations with the European Union and further increase Poland's clout in Europe, while reviving democracy within his country. As a familiar advocate of European unity, he would be embraced in Brussels and probably succeed in freeing funding that the EU denied Poland during clashes over the rule of law. Tusk would reliably side with other EU moderates, leaving the bloc's hard-right icon, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, more isolated. Poland's influence in Europe and NATO has already grown because of its proximity to the war in Ukraine and its staunch support for Kiev. Tusk could elevate Warsaw further, giving it closer parity to Paris, Berlin and Rome and shifting Europe's center of gravity further east. But hopes would be highest for what he could accomplish. Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of Law and Justice and Poland's deputy prime minister, has described LGBTQ+ rights as a threat to Catholic Poland. Towns influenced by the hard right have declared themselves LGBTQ+ free zones. Tusk, meanwhile, has vowed to push for civil unions for same-sex couples and a transgender law that would make it easier for Poles to legally declare themselves a different gender. He has also pledged to weaken Poland's near-total ban on abortion. Late Sunday and into Monday, advocates of women's and LGBTQ+ rights celebrated. The nightmare ends, gay Polish activist Bart Staszewski said on X, "I am gay, I am Polish and I am proud today. After 8 years of hate against people like me. Poland is back on the path of democracy and the rule of law." But Tusk, who took a sharply anti-migrant stance during the campaign, would also need to manage a host of socially conservative politicians within his core alliance. It remains unclear how much change he could bring to Poland and how fast. The outcome is being especially watched in Washington, Brussels, Kiev and Moscow, where Poland is seen as central to the West's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Poland led Europe's backing of Kiev, criticizing attempts at dialogue with Russian President Vladimir Putin and equipping Ukraine with German-made Leopard 2 tanks and Polish-made 29 fighters. But domestic politics have clouded that support. Last month, a dispute over the impact of Ukrainian grain exports on Polish farmers escalated to the point where Morawiecki, the prime minister, threatened an end to Polish arms shipments. Tusk, meanwhile, has promised unyielding backing for Ukraine. PiS has sought to paint Tusk as pro-Russian, a description several analysts dismiss as false. He would, however, be less likely to engage in the kind of political theater that saw Morawiecki lock horns with French President Emmanuel Macron last year over dialogue attempts with Putin. "It's nonsense that PiS is more anti-Russian than Tusk," Boris said. What is true is that Tusk in the past, and probably in the future, would use more care in relations with EU partners. U.S. seeks Gaza aid, safe zones as Israeli invasion looms. Tel Aviv, Israel. President Biden weighed an unprecedented trip to Israel on Monday as a humanitarian crisis mounted in Gaza, where aid remained blocked, and Israeli generals prepared for the military's most significant operation in years. The challenge facing U.S. diplomatic efforts was crystallized as air sirens' warning of incoming rocket fire disrupted a meeting between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israel's war cabinet, sending the top U.S. diplomat and Israeli military officials rushing to a nearby shelter. The dramatic moment underscored the stark decisions facing Israeli and U.S. officials. Aid workers warned that Gaza was already reckoning with a humanitarian disaster because of Israel's blockade of water and electricity, a punishing response to the Hamas attack that killed more than 1,400 people. Israel's planned invasion, aimed at eradicating the territory's ruling Hamas government, would inevitably deepen the crisis. The operation is expected to focus in part on the de facto capital, Gaza City, and the network of tunnels Hamas militants used to ferry weapons and evade strikes, according to senior U.S. and Israeli officials. The officials spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive military plans. Already, at least 2,778 people have been killed in Gaza and almost 10,000 wounded. Body bags have run out and the dead are now being buried in mass graves. U.S. officials said they were attempting to create safe zones and limit civilian casualties, while also trying to deter Iran and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah from entering the conflict, using diplomatic back channels to warn adversaries against opening a new front. The Pentagon is sending 2 aircraft carrier strike groups to the Middle East. Amid the tension, Biden is considering visiting Israel as early as this week, in what would be a high-stakes demonstration of support for its ally, U.S. officials said. Israeli officials remained adamant that a violent response targeting Hamas in Gaza was necessary. This will be a long war, the price will be high, but we are going to win, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told Blinken during a meeting in Tel Aviv. Blinken then joined a meeting of Israel's war cabinet when the country's commercial capital came under rocket fire. The meeting was one of several the secretary has had during his second visit to the Jewish state in the span of 4 days aimed at conveying Washington's unequivocal support for Israel. You have and always have the support of the United States, Blinken told Israel's defense minister. Earlier, Blinken sought to negotiate a deal to open the Rafah crossing on the Egypt-Gaza border, to allow much-needed aid in and foreigners and dual nationals out. Following his meeting Sunday with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, Blinken said Rafah will be opened so that hundreds of U.S. citizens could have the chance to leave. He added that the United States was in talks with the United Nations, Egypt, Israel and others to agree on a mechanism to allow aid into Gaza. Egypt also believed a deal had been reached with the United States and Israel to open the crossing for almost 5 hours on Monday, to allow 100 trucks carrying humanitarian aid into Gaza and foreign passport holders to leave the Strip, according to a person with knowledge of Egyptian diplomatic efforts, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive negotiations. Several hundred people gathered on the Palestinian side of the gate Monday in anticipation of the border reopening, television footage from the crossing showed. Palestinians who have been waiting for days on the Egyptian side of the border to cross back to their families in Gaza piled into buses on Monday to wait, according to Ahmed Salem, head of the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights, which has a team monitoring the border. But the crossing remained closed, and Jens Lerke, spokesman in Geneva for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, said Monday that the agreement was not, as of this point, a done deal. The standoff over the border crossing deepened frustration and panic among aid groups, which warned that time is running out for wounded and displaced Gazans to receive critical, and in many cases, life-saving, supplies, as the humanitarian situation rapidly deteriorates. More than 2 million people live in Gaza, a cramped enclave that has been ruled by Hamas for 17 years. Israeli troops were massed along the territory's border, after warning more than 1 million residents to leave northern Gaza and retreat to the south. Israeli officials have declared the area under full siege, meaning that no food, fuel or medicines are allowed to enter. To keep the lights on in Gaza City's largest hospital, Wissam Abu Jared, an anesthetist, said staff were collecting gas from dwindling stocks in the area to maintain a steady supply to their generators. If we run out of fuel, then we will lose all of the patients in the ICU, the babies in the incubators, and the patients who need surgery, Abu Jared said. He said that some staff had been reduced to drinking from 4 solution bags, because Israel had cut off water supplies to the enclave. But even as Palestinians fled northern Gaza, Israeli strikes continued to pummel the relatively safer cities in the south. In Rafah, the crossing itself was damaged by a strike on October 10, leading to its closure. In Rafah city nearby, civilians have also been killed. One resident, Mohammed Youssef Abu Taha, described through tears how he had been stocking up on groceries with his son and his sister Monday morning when an Israeli airstrike slammed into the street up ahead of them. "It fell in the sand," he said. "If it had hit the building, we would instantly have died." The newly appointed U.S. envoy for humanitarian efforts, David Satterfield, a former ambassador to Lebanon and Turkey, is now charged with helping establish safe zones inside Gaza, U.S. officials said. But the practicalities remain elusive, and aid groups have warned that forced displacement without guarantees of safe passage or return would amount to a war crime. At the same time, a U.S. official, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a decision that had not yet been made public, said that the Pentagon had issued prepare to deploy orders this week for roughly 2,000 service members as part of the Biden administration's evolving response to the crisis in the Middle East, essentially shortening the time period in which that personnel must be ready to deploy if military leaders make that decision. The troops, who were categorized as advisory and medical personnel, are not expected to be sent into Israel but could be sent to the Middle East or moved around within the region. The decision was first reported by the Wall Street Journal. In Israel, the director of Israel's Shin Bet Security Service, Ronen Bar, said in an all-staff memo published Monday that he took responsibility for failing to thwart the attack by Hamas militants. The brazen, multi-pronged assault in southern Israel sent shockwaves across the country, puncturing the widespread view among Israelis that the nation's extensive surveillance apparatus would detect plans for an attack before it was carried out. "The responsibility is mine. Despite a series of actions we carried out, unfortunately, on Saturday we were unable to establish sufficient deterrence so as to thwart the attack," Barr said. "There will be time for investigations. Now we are fighting." Israeli officials said Monday that its military was holding a number of gunmen that it captured during the attack. The Israel Defense Forces was also reviewing body camera footage taken from some of the prisoners, as well as from slain Hamas fighters, giving the army more insight into their movements, planning and communications, Israel's chief military spokesman, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, said. The material also added to the gruesome and growing evidence of the killings and torture carried out by Palestinian militants in the day-long rampage. Among the images the Post was allowed to view Monday were previously unviewed scenes of a man being beheaded with a garden hoe, bodies of burned children and infants, and drivers being shot. Much of the new material comes from cameras worn on the vests or helmets of many of the attackers, and from cell phones they carried. In Gaza, about 200 to 250 Israeli captives are also being held, the spokesman for Hamas's armed wing said in an audio recording Monday, which was broadcast by the Al Jazeera News Network. At least 200 captives are held by Hamas, the spokesman, Abu Obaida said, while the rest are being held by different armed factions in Gaza. Fighting also flared along Israel's borders with Lebanon and Syria, raising the prospect that the conflict could still drag in more regional players. The IDF said Monday that it plans to evacuate Israelis from 28 communities within 2 kilometers, 1.2 miles, of the country's border with Lebanon, after exchanging fire with Iran-backed Hezbollah overnight. On Monday, Hezbollah released a video showing its snipers shooting at Israeli surveillance cameras at several points along the border, destroying them. Hamas leader Khalid Meshal, who lives outside Gaza, said he was grateful for the actions Hezbollah has taken against Israel in an interview Monday with an Arabic-language news channel. But the battle needs more, Meshal said. Parker and Mahfouz reported from Cairo and Lovelock from London. Steve Hendricks contributed reporting from Tel Aviv. Hazem Balusha in Gaza, Noga Tarnopolsky in Jerusalem, Karen DeYoung and Missy Ryan in Washington, Kevin Seif in Mexico City and Leo Sands in London contributed to this report. Marty Ahtisaari, conflict mediator who won Nobel Peace Prize, dies at 86. In addition to serving as president of Finland, he helped resolve ethnic and political conflicts around the world. Marty Ahtisaari, a gifted diplomat and former president of Finland who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008 for his patient, hands-on role mediating ethnic and political conflicts in South Africa, Kosovo, and Northern Ireland, died October 16. He was 86. The Finnish organization CMI, which Mr. Ahtisaari founded to promote peace and resolve international conflicts, announced his death but did not provide additional details. Finland's president, Sauli Niinistö, disclosed in 2021 that Mr. Ahtisaari was suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. In his Nobel lecture, Mr. Adhasari struck an undaunted, hopeful tone that typified his approach to diplomacy. Peace is a question of will, he said. All conflicts can be settled, and there are no excuses for allowing them to become eternal. It is simply intolerable that violent conflicts defy resolution for decades, causing immeasurable human suffering, and preventing economic and social development. Mr. Adhasari employed what Gareth Evans, a former president of the International Crisis Group, once described as a negotiating style that combines charm and good humor with an iron determination. After Mr. Adhasari negotiated a peace agreement between Indonesia and the separatist Free Aceh movement in 2005, Indonesian government envoy Farid Hussein said that Mr. Adhasari exuded authority like a father and that his method was really extraordinary. He said, "Do you want to win, or do you want peace?" Mr. Adhasari joined Finland's foreign ministry in 1965 and began his first major peace effort in the 1970s, helping secure Namibia's independence from South Africa while serving as a special appointee of the United Nations. In return for his help, Namibia made him an honorary citizen. Many boys in Namibia are named Marty, Old Dambolt Joes, a member of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, told the New York Times in 2008. That must be at least as great an honor as being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1994, Mr. Adhasari, a social democrat, was elected president in Finland's first direct presidential election, which had previously been determined by an electoral college. He helped guide the country's move into the European Union and presided over a significant drop in unemployment. Toward the end of his presidential term in 1999, Mr. Adhasari worked with former Russian Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin and Strobe Talbot, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, to broker an agreement leading to Serbia's military withdrawal from Kosovo. 6 years later, the United Nations appointed Mr. Adhasari as special envoy to Kosovo, overseeing negotiations for its eventual declaration of independence from Serbia. In between his Kosovo assignments, Mr. Adhasari worked as a weapons inspector monitoring caches of arms that the Irish Republican Army agreed to dump. Examining a pile of rifles stored in a woodsy building resembling a potato cellar, Mr. Adhasari broke the tension by telling another inspector, "There must be a better way to earn one's living," according to The Mediator, a biography of Marty Adhasari, 2015, by Katri Maricalio and Tapani Ruokainen. Martti Oiva-Kalevi Adhasari was born June 23, 1937, in Viipuri, a town in eastern Finland. His father was a millworker and then an army vehicle mechanic. His mother was a homemaker. World War II was the defining event of his life. When he was 2, Soviet troops arrived in his town, causing his family to flee. Like several 100,000 fellow Karelians, we became refugees in our own country as great power politics caused the borders of Finland to be redrawn and left my hometown as part of the Soviet Union, Mr. Adhasari said in his Nobel lecture. This childhood experience contributed to my commitment to working on the resolution of conflicts. Mr. Adhasari graduated from the Oulu University Teacher Training School in 1959 and became a teacher. After a year in the classroom, he became an aid worker, first in Pakistan and then for international student organizations. After joining Finland's foreign ministry, he served as an ambassador to Tanzania, Zambia, and Somalia. Negotiating ethnic and political conflicts required the skills of a ship's pilot, consulting medical doctor, midwife and teacher, Mr. Adhasari said in his Nobel lecture. Mediators do not choose the conflicts they became involved in, but the parties to the conflict choose the mediator, he said. Their participation as intermediaries is based on the trust of all the conflicting parties. Mr. Adhasari married Eva Hivarinen in 1968. Survivors include his wife and their son, Marco. During his Nobel lecture, Mr. Adhasari weighed in on the seemingly intractable conflicts in the Middle East. The tensions and wars in the region have been going on for so long that many have come to believe that the Middle East knot can never be untied, he said. Mr. Adhasari disagreed. The credibility of the whole international community is at stake, he said. We cannot go on, year after year, simply pretending to do something to help the situation in the Middle East. We must also get results. Mr. Adhasari did not accept the common view that tensions between religions made the problem unsolvable. During my career I have seen many crises in which religion has been used as a weapon or as an instrument for prolonging the conflict, Mr. Adasari said. Religions themselves are, however, peace-loving. For Gazan workers stranded in Israel, being apart from family is agony. Jericho, West Bank. For the first 4 days of the war, Adli Salim kept working at a construction site near Tel Aviv, trying not to panic. Like thousands of other Palestinian workers from Gaza, he found himself suddenly stranded in Israel and separated from his family. Salim frantically tried to stay in touch with his wife and 7 children back in the besieged enclave amid relentless Israeli airstrikes. Israel soon cancelled all permits for Gazan workers and erased them from the phone application that they used to prove their legal status. Israel brought me here legally, Salim said. Police beat and detained him, he said, before he finally made his way to Ramallah, and then, to Jericho. Now I just want to go home. Thousands of Gazan workers have sought refuge in the West Bank, where they've been taken in by Palestinian communities, uniting across political and geographic divides. The men interviewed by the Washington Post said they had lost touch with friends and family members working in the country and assumed they were in Israeli detention. The confusion over the whereabouts of Gazan workers is indicative of the chaos that has gripped Israel since October 7, when Hamas gunmen rampaged through the south and killed at least 1,400 people. Retaliatory Israeli strikes have killed more than 2,700 Palestinians in Gaza, and a ground invasion looms. An unspecified number of Palestinians from Gaza are being kept in an Israeli holding facility in the West Bank, according to a statement from the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, or COGAT, an arm of Israel's Ministry of Defense. The matter of continuing to hold them and moving others to the facility is being looked into by the political echelon, the statement said. Since Hamas seized control of Gaza in 2007, Israel has blockaded the coastal enclave to contain the militant group, all while maintaining an unofficial economic peace. Israel's giving and taking of worker permits was a key part of its strategy to influence Hamas and improve conditions for some of Gaza's 2 million residents. Israel had approved 18,500 permits for Gazan workers. It's unclear how many were in the country at the time of the attack. Getting a permit involved extensive security checks. Workers traveled through the Erez crossing, where Israel allowed them to carry only a small bag without electronics or toiletries. They typically spent a week or 2 at a time in the country and returned home on weekends. Hamas, in turn, had appeared increasingly interested in governing in recent years, leading some analysts to credit the group with a more pragmatic turn. Now, Israel has vowed to destroy Hamas, and workers from Gaza are caught in legal purgatory. Salim has held one of the coveted work permits for 2 years, allowing him to escape grinding unemployment in Gaza, where 8 in 10 people live below the poverty line. On Wednesday, several police officers approached Salim at his construction site and asked where he was from. When he said Gaza, they beat him on his head and back, tied his hands and feet together, and imprisoned him, he said. After 2 days, according to Salim, police dropped him off at a West Bank checkpoint. The Israeli police did not respond to a request for comment. On Friday, Salim arrived in Jericho, where Palestinian authorities are housing some 1,900 Gazan workers, the deputy mayor, Yusra Swady, said. Stranded Gazans, no one could say how many, have also gone to Tulkarem, Tubas, Ramallah and other Palestinian towns and cities in the West Bank, she said. In Jericho, about 450 Gazans are being housed in a large police training center run by Fatah, Hamas's bitter rival, the party that dominates the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority. You might be sitting, and suddenly someone comes pulling off his hair and screaming, "I lost my house, my children were martyred," said Daoud Abdullah Borgal, 60, an administrative official at the facility. The men sleep in rooms packed with long cushions and mismatched sheets and blankets. Authorities are providing food, clothes, and medicine, Swady said. They will stay in Jericho until the war is over and they can go back to Gaza, she said. But desperation is rising. Get me back to my children, pleaded Ibrahim Abu Awad, from the town of Bani Suhaila, in South Gaza. His family, like hundreds of thousands of displaced Gazans, had fled to a United Nations school in Khan Yunis. Abu Awad left Gaza on October 5, 2 days before the attack. He was working in Caesarea on Saturday when he was detained, then released by Israeli police. His Arab landlord told him to hire a taxi with 2 other workers, which dropped them at a West Bank checkpoint. "I can't stay here, eating and drinking while my children are dying," he said. "There is no electricity or water or anything. Let me die there between my children." 30 miles away, in Al Ram, just behind Israel's separation barrier with the West Bank, 35 laborers were staying at a reception hall, typically used for celebrations. On Monday, they gathered for a breakfast of pita, Jerusalem round bread and hummus, served on pink plastic plates. Afterward, they sat around, smoked cigarettes and wearily waited for their families in Gaza to pick up the phone. Odai Musa, from the Deir al-Balah refugee camp, has a degree in sports education. For the last 8 months, he's worked painting buildings in Israel. His family back home is in agony, he said. He is glued to the news on television and social media. "My message," he said, "is to stop this war. We don't want conflicts or wars or anything." Mousa's 8-year-old son is sick with a liver disease. He had recently procured an Israeli permit for the boy to leave Gaza and receive treatment at a hospital in Jerusalem, he said. That's off the table now. In the chaos of war, as Gaza's healthcare system collapses, he can't access the medicine he needs at all, Musa said. Raid al-Akluk is from Beit Lahia in northern Gaza, where Israel ordered some 1.1 million people to evacuate in recent days. He's proud that his oldest children are engineers and architects, not laborers like him. In a phone call Monday, his family tried to reassure him that they were all right. "Is electricity back?" he asked. The first cell phone he tried to call had been turned off. "No," said his youngest, 10-year-old Heba. "How is the water?" he asked. "There is water, don't worry," she said. "We have everything, don't worry." But he knew it wasn't true.